Hello, this is Joost Daemen from the Thorax Center in Rotterdam, currently live in San Diego, sunny San Diego actually, where we are about to finish the 30th anniversary of the TCT Congress, this year TCT 2018. To me, an incredible Congress with a lot of great science, a lot of participants actually, but also quite some blockbuster trials which have been presented over the last 4 days. So the trial at the Congress actually started Saturday, September 22nd, with a series of coronary stent trials. So I will highlight the ones that at least stood out to me. First one I would like to mention is the BIONYX Trial, which was a 2,500 patients all-comers trial presented by our Dutch colleague Clemens van Biergelen, who actually compared in a non-inferiority design ONYX versus Orciro. The study concluded that there was actually no significant difference between both devices as expected. Event curves almost overlapped. What stood out a little bit in the trial to me were the event rates, which are quite low, around 4.5% in both arms, and even more particularly in the ONYX stent, the stent thrombosis rate was only 0.1%, which is quite hard to imagine in daily practice in which you do an all-comer study with 60-70% ACS. So that led to some discussion within the panel after the presentation. But nevertheless, I think another nice trial which helps us in further understanding the potential benefit of biodegradable polymer stents up until 1 year. Second large stent trial on Saturday was the RECREATE study presented by Peter Stella from Utrecht, comparing the first actually amphilimous eluting drug-eluting stent to a Resolute comparator. Also this trial actually showed overlapping event curves at 1 year, identical rates of target lesion failure. What was a little bit interesting in this study to me was that they applied a 1-month DAPT strategy for both stents up until only 1 month for all stable patients. Stratified analysis focusing on those showed actually no differences between both devices. But what was interesting is that the 1-month DAPT strategy appeared to be safe actually for both devices, although obviously there was no comparator here. Also in this trial, quite low event rates. Finally, third trial on DES on Saturday, the TALENT study, which was performed by under the leadership of Patrick Serruys, who looked for cheaper and perhaps more accessible alternatives to the current generation drug-eluting stents. So they investigated actually very thin strut cobalt chromium supraflex stent with struts of only 60 micron made in India, and compared that to the previous best-in-class Zyne stents. What the trial showed actually a little bit as expected, also here overlapping event curve with no significant difference in any of the endpoints between either the supraflex or the Zynes. However, what was interesting is that there was a little bit higher device failure in the supraflex group. Approximately 2% of the cases in them the operator was not able to get the device across the lesion as compared to 0.1% in the Zynes arm. A little bit of a difference, however, which at the end did not translate in any meaningful clinical differences in terms of the endpoints. So to me, I think a nice trial which showed the concept that also these newer, perhaps more cheaper stents are good alternatives to the devices we use at present. Another stent trial on Saturday from Denmark, SOLVE-TAVI, already the 9th out of a successful series of stent trials. Again, a real-world comparison, large number of patients, in this case Orciro versus BioFreedom, also showing as expected more or less overlapping event curves, no difference between both devices. Interesting part on this study is that it added towards the safety of the BioFreedom stent with stent thrombosis rates of 0.7%, which were identical to the Orciro arm, and a little bit tempered the potential fear of higher stent thrombosis rate with the BioFreedom, which was seen in the previous Leaders 3 trial. So from that perspective, also an interesting trial to me. A little bit more on BioFreedom was shown also in Leaders 3-2. Actually a study that was not randomized. It was a study designed to confirm the safety and the efficacy of the BioFreedom stent to get US market approval. Again, almost 1,500 patients studied and showing actually identical rates as the BioFreedom arm in Leaders 3, confirming the safety and the performance of this device. Interestingly, also in this registry, so to speak, which was propensity matched to the bare metal stent arm of leaders 3. Again, significantly lower rates of death and MI with the biofreedom as compared to bare metal stents in these high-risk patients. Very interesting, still to me one of the only stent trials which has ever shown that. And also in the panel quite some discussion but no clear answer as to what kind of rationale might be behind this. So perhaps more to come on that in the future with longer term follow-up. So that was the Saturday, quite a busy day, but it continued. So on Sunday, 23rd, perhaps one of the most exciting days because that started with COAPT, perhaps the blockbuster of the TCT meeting this year. So COAPT, as all of you know, was a trial designed almost 8 years ago to to assess the safety and efficacy of the mitral clip for treating patients with secondary mitral regurgitation. At the end, the trial enrolled screened over 1,500 patients and was able to enroll 600. Which at the end were randomized either to mitral clip or optimal medical heart failure therapy. There was a lot of focus in the presentation on the scrutinity of this trial in terms of how patients were selected. I think that also explained the fact that almost 900 patients were excluded, despite the fact that all of them were actually deemed eligible by the individual operators in the site. Nevertheless, despite this scrutinity, the trial was able to show significant reductions in the primary endpoint being rehospitalization for heart failure. So actually almost 47% reduction in rehospitalizations. But perhaps even more interesting to me was the fact that there was a striking difference also in mortality up until 2 years follow-up. Something that completely contradicted the previous findings of the MITRA-FR and eventually was explained by the fact that these patients were perhaps better selected. And this trial, more particularly, did not include those patients who were maybe already too far gone in their heart failure with more dilated ventricles, higher end-diastolic volumes, etc. So a study that will definitely change the guidelines. Second study on heart failure devices was presented by Horst Sievert, the REDUCE-FMR, which evaluated the safety and efficacy of the CARILON device. Somewhat different concept than the mitral clip. So the CARILON is an annuloplasty device which can be implanted also transvenously. The trial eventually enrolled, sham controlled, so that was interesting, a total of 120 patients, of which 87 were eventually in the intention to treat cohort. And what the trial showed is that the primary endpoint was met, so the device was able to get a significant reduction in regurgitation volume as compared to those treated with the sham procedure. Small trial, but definitely more to come on that device. Second trial on these valves was presented by Holger Thiele, the SOLVE-TAVI trial. So as mentioned in the preview already, this is the first actually head-to-head comparison of TAVIs in the field to date. So from that perspective, quite interesting. So patients were randomized one-to-one to either the Evolute R or the SAPIEN 3. And what the investigators showed that at 1 year, the performance of the device in terms of primary endpoint was non-inferior, so there was no difference between both devices. However, there was a difference, what at least stood out to me, in the risk of stroke, which was slightly higher with the SAPIEN 3, 4.7% versus 0.5 in the Evolute. On the other hand, was remarkable and also caused quite some discussion in the panel was the fact that the pacemaker rate were quite high. So at the end, 20% of the patients in both cohorts ended up with a pacemaker, which is at least almost twice as high as you would have expected based on the findings of the larger series of partner trials. Second interesting part in this study was the fact that there was a 2x2 factorial design for general anesthesia. And that to me was maybe even more interesting because what this showed was that there was no difference in whether or not patients received general anesthesia or not in terms of the identified primary endpoint, being death, MI, stroke, or infection requiring antibiotics or acute kidney injury. Finally, looking at the more specific secondary endpoints, what was interesting is that there was no difference at all in procedure time, around 170 minutes for both groups. And that is something that to me is hard to explain. If you get a patient under general anesthesia, that this does not result in a reduction in procedure time is something I cannot understand. But perhaps more to come on that. Monday, second last day of late breaker, started with the ultimate. So ultimate, as mentioned also in the preview, the largest IVUS-guided PCI randomized controlled trial to date, over 1,500 patients from China, randomized 1-to-1 to very strict IVUS-guided treatment protocol with both pre and post-procedure IVUS versus a angiographic treatment as per routine practice, however with mandated post-dilatation in all patients. So this trial showed what was expected a little bit by me also following the results of the IVUS XPL. Significant superiority, so a significant p-value for IVUS-guided treatment as compared to angio-guided treatment. Event rates were 2.9 versus 5.4 and the benefit of IVUS, so quite striking. So I think the trial adds to IVUS XPL and makes the findings even more broad because the patient population was somewhat more real world than the previous trials performed to date. So to me, very well presented trial as well, which might add to the amount and to the body of evidence supporting IVUS-guided treatment in daily life. LRP was the next one. So this is a study that also many of us have been looking out for, a large registry, including almost 1,500 patients with non-culprit lesion assessment of vulnerable plaques by LipiScan. So actually what the authors did is they assessed 2.1 arteries, non-culprit arteries per PCI patient and assessed them with the infraradics catheter to get a LCBI, so the lipid core burden index value. So there was quite some focus on the statistics, but at the end I think it was interesting. The study showed that if you have an LCBI above 400, so that was the threshold identified upfront, you are at significantly higher risk for getting MACE in the non-culprit artery. So the statistics, I think that's something that needs to be digested a bit further. What the authors concluded is that the hazard ratio was 1.18, meaning that the risk for future non-culprit MACE would be around 18% increased if the LCBI max 4 millimeter would be increased per 100 units. So something I think you need to read again in the paper and digest a bit, but I think it definitely proved the concept of the LCBI, proved the concept of the validity of measuring lipid core burden index in the plaque. I will definitely have a future in the way we identify patients in the future. Finally, also on Monday, OAC-ALONE. So OAC-ALONE was actually the first randomized controlled trial testing current guideline recommendations for patients with PCI and AFib. So what we do at present is after 1 year you usually switch to OAC-ALONE in patients on AFib. However, the amount of, or the body of evidence supporting this is very limited. So OAC-ALONE was the first study addressing this issue in almost 700 patients, which were randomized 1-to-1 to either OAC plus single antiplatelet therapy or OAC-ALONE. Results were somehow disappointing in that sense that the trial failed to meet its non-inferiority endpoint because of the fact that the sample size appeared finally to be too small. On the other hand, if you look at the figures, we found that there was in the primary endpoint of death, MI, stroke or systemic embolism, identical event rates between either OAC-ALONE or OAC plus single antiplatelet therapy. And if you look at the secondary endpoints, also a little bit as expected to me. The more potent the anticoagulation regimen, the higher performance, so rates of stent thrombosis and MI somewhat lower in those on OAC plus a single antiplatelet. However, bleeding on the flip side, slightly higher in the patients who also received the single antiplatelet agent on top of the OAC. So I think a trial that needs to get some follow-up in the future as well, but definitely was worth following. Finally, FAST-FFR, one of the areas in which I also have a very particular interest. So this was the study of CathWorks testing the performance of their FFR angio as compared to patients undergoing invasively measured pressure wire based FFR. So the study concluded again, as following also the results of MEDIS-MP, a very high correlation between FFR angio as compared to invasively measured FFR across the whole spectrum of measured values. So I think an important study that also will be the step up to future larger trials, further elucidating the potential of these kind of angio-based physiology assessment. Finally, last day, Tuesday 25, quite a lot of trials already. 2 trials I want to lift out from Tuesday. The blockbuster on Tuesday, obviously ABSORB-4, as mentioned, presented by Greg Stone again, the largest BVS trial to date, over 2,600 patients. Particularly interesting because they also included a significant proportion of patients which were actually ACS positive, so that added to all the previous ABSORB trials to date. However, a little bit as expected, complete non-inferiority at 30 days, non-inferiority at 1 year between BVS and the comparator Zymes. However, also in this trial, numerically again, higher rates of MI and stent thrombosis in those patients treated with BVS. Interestingly to mention that in this trial a specific focus was made on the occurrence of angina. So the trial was specifically powered to look at that, and interestingly no difference whatsoever between the occurrence of angina post-PCI in patients treated with either Zymes or BVS. So I think this trial definitely nails down that discussion and reassures us that the type of either BRS or DES does not impact the occurrence of angina in the future. So from that perspective, an interesting study. More on BVS on Tuesday. So as we all know, the device is, let's say, no longer used that much commercially, and this is further supported by the results of the ABSORB COMPARE trial. Also large BVS trial developed already many years ago, but in this case focusing really on more complex patients. So all the patients in this trial had to fulfill the criteria of a high risk likelihood of restenosis. So the trial had actually 2 endpoints. One was non-inferiority for Zymes at 1 year, but also particular interest in the occurrence of events between 1 and 5 years. Looking at the potential of the BVS, which might only become beneficial at the long run. However, the trial was stopped prematurely due to high rates of stent thrombosis in the BVS arm, and that was confirmed in the presentation of today, showing a non-inferiority for the primary endpoint, target lesion failure at 1 year. However, substantially higher rates of MI and stent thrombosis, in this case significantly, as compared to patients treated with Zymes. So I think that closes the door for BVS in its current format today, at least to me. Final trial I would like to mention from Tuesday is the RADIOSOUND trial. So the RADIOSOUND was actually the first one-to-one comparative trial on renal denervation devices. So that made it to me quite interesting. So the trial was presented by Philip Lourdes. Interesting to mention, he was the one who won the Linnemeyer Award on Monday as most promising young physician. Congratulations on that, Philip. Back to the trial, 120 patients which were randomized either to a simplicity-guided hypertension treatment in the main branch only, simplicity-guided treatment main branch and side branches, as according to the simplicity on and off med protocol, or a Recall Paradise ultrasound balloon denervation for the main branch only. Patients were included with hypertension, so mean ABPM needed to be above 135, systolic, on treatment, stable anti-hypertensive treatment. So quite a representative patient population, I would like to say. Then the outcome, a bit surprising to me. So what the authors showed first was that there was apparently a clear difference in effect between those patients treated with a main branch only with approximately 17 ablations versus main plus side branches, which resulted in 37 ablations. So the more extensive ablation also in this trial appeared to be more effective, resulting in an ABPM drop, systolic, of 8 millimeters of mercury as compared to 6 millimeters of mercury in those who had only main branch treatment. So that added some body of evidence to that. But much more interesting was that numerically the Recall device appeared more performance, with a reduction in systolic ABPM of 13 millimeters of mercury, which was actually almost double of what was seen in the Radiance solo trial, which was obviously a bit of a different patient population. Patients were off drugs. We need to be thinking about comparing that to the Recall on-med study, the TRIO. But at least a very interesting study showing the difference in the performance between the devices Finally, what was outstanding, that this difference did not translate in a difference in responder rates. Also in this trial, very consistent with all previous evidence, exactly identical responder rates, around 70%, irrespective of the treatment strategy. So with that, I would like to leave it and would like to conclude TCT 2018 this year. Thank you for watching, and we're looking forward to catching up with you in future meetings. Thank you.